Good day, loves. We will be continuing reading the Geneva Convention. This is the first Geneva Convention. This is Chapter 2, The Wounded and Sick. Hope you're ready with a cup of tea. Article 12. Members of the armed forces and other persons mentioned in the following article, who are wounded or sick, shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. They shall be treated humanely and cared for by the party to the conflict in whose power they may be, without any adverse distinction founded on sex, race, nationality, religion, political opinions, or any other similar criteria. Any attempts upon their lives or violence to their persons shall be strictly prohibited. In particular, they shall not be murdered or exterminated, subject to torture or biological experiments. They shall not willfully be left without medical assistance and care, nor shall conditions exposing them to contagion or infection be created. Only urgent medical reasons will authorize priority in order of treatment to be administered. Women shall be treated with all consideration due to their sex. The party to the conflict, which is compelled to abandon wounded or sick to the enemy, as far as military considerations permit, leave them with a part of its medical personnel and material to assist in their care. 13. The present convention shall apply to the wounded and sick belonging to the following categories: members of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, as well as members of militias or volunteer corps forming part of such armed forces. Members of other militias and members of other volunteer corps, including those of organized resistance movements belonging to a party to the conflict and operating in or outside their own territory, even if this territory is occupied, provided that such militias or volunteer corps, including such organized resistance movements, fulfill the following conditions: that of being commanded by a person responsible for his subordinates, that of having fixed and distinctive sign recognizable at a distance, that of carrying arms openly, that of conducting their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. 3. Members of the regular armed forces who profess allegiance to a government or authority not recognized by the detaining power. 4. Persons who accompany the armed forces without actually being members thereof, such as civilian members of military aircraft crews, war correspondents, supply contractors, members of labor units, or of services responsible for the welfare of the armed forces, provided that they have received authorization from the armed forces which they accompany. 5. Members of crews, including master pilots and apprentices of the merchant marine and the crews of civil aircraft of the parties to the conflict, who do not benefit by more favorable treatment under any other provisions in international law. 6. Inhabitants of non-occupied territory who, on the approach of the enemy, 6. Inhabitants of a non-occupied territory who, on the approach of the enemy, spontaneously take up arms to resist the invading forces without having time to form themselves into regular armed units, provided they carry arms openly and respect the laws and customs of war. 14. Subject to the provisions of Article 12, the wounded and the sick of a belligerent who fall into enemy hands shall be prisoners of war, and the provision of international law concerning prisoners of war shall apply to them. Article 15. At all times, and particularly after an engagement, parties to the conflict shall without delay take all possible measures to search for and collect wounded and sick, to protect against the pillage and ill treatment, to ensure the adequate care and search for the dead and prevent their being despoiled. Whenever circumstances permit, an armistice or suspension of fire shall be arranged, or local arrangements made to permit the removal, exchange, and transport of the wounded left on the battlefield. Likewise, local arrangements may be concluded between parties to the conflict for the removal or exchange of wounded and sick from a besieged or encircled area, and for the passage of medical and religious personnel and equipment on their way to that area. Article 16. Parties to the conflict shall record as soon as possible, in respect to each of the wounded, sick, or dead persons of the adverse party falling into their hands, any particulars which may assist in his identifications. These records should, if possible, include: A. Designation of the power on which he depends. B. Army, regimental, personal, or serial number. C. Surname. D. First name or names. E. Date of birth. F. Any other particulars shown on his identity cards or disc. G. Date and place of capture or death. H. Particulars concerning wounds, illness, or cause of death. As soon as possible, the above-mentioned information shall be forwarded to the Enforcement Bureau described in Article 122 of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war of August 12, 1949, which shall transmit this information to the power on which these persons depend through the intermediary of the protecting power and the Central Prisoners of War Agency. Parties to the conflict shall prepare and forward to each other through the same bureau certificates of death or duly authenticated lists of the dead. They likewise shall collect and forward through the same bureau 1/2 of a double identity disc, last wills, or other documents of importance to the next of kin, money, and in general all articles of intrinsic or sentimental value which are found on the dead. These articles, together with unidentified articles, shall be sent in sealed packets, accompanied by statements giving all particulars necessary for the identifications of the deceased's owners, as well by a complete list of the contents of the parcel. Article 17. Parties to the conflict shall ensure that burial or cremation of the dead carried out individually, as far as circumstances permit, is preceded by careful examination, if possible by medical examination of the bodies, with a view to confirming death, establishing identity, and enabling a report to be made. 1/2 of the double identity disc, or the identity disc itself, if it is a single disc, should remain on the body. Bodies shall not be cremated except for imperative reasons of hygiene, for motives based on the religion of the deceased. In case of cremation, the circumstances and the reason for the cremation shall be stated in detail in the death certificate or on the authenticated list of the dead. They shall further ensure that the dead are honorably interred, if possible, according to the rites of the religion to which they belong, that their graves are respected and grouped, if possible, according to the nationality of the deceased, properly maintained and marked so that they may always be found. For this purpose, they shall organize at the commencement of hostilities an official graves registration service to allow subsequent exhumations and ensure the identifications of body wherever the sites of the graves, and all the possible transportation to the home country. These provisions shall likewise apply to ashes, which shall be kept by the Graves Registration Service until properly disposed thereof, in accordance with the wishes of the home country. as soon as circumstances permit, and the latest and at latest, at the end of hostilities, these services shall exchange, through the Enforcement Bureau mentioned in the second paragraph of Article 16, lists showing exact locations and markings of the graves, together with the particulars of the dead interred therein. Article 18. The military authorities may appeal to the charity of the inhabitants voluntarily to collect and care for, under their direction, the wounded and sick, granting persons who have responded to this appeal the necessary protections and facilities. Should the adverse party take or retake control of the area, it shall likewise grant these persons the same protections and the same facilities. The military authorities shall permit the inhabitants and relief societies, even in invaded or occupied areas, spontaneously to collect and care for wounded or sick of whatever nationality. The civilian population shall respect these wounded and sick, and in particular abstain from offering them violence. No one may ever be molested or convicted for having nursed the wounded or sick. The provisions of the present article do not relieve the occupying power of its obligation to give both physical and moral care to the wounded and sick. That is Chapter 2 of the First Geneva Convention for the amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick in the armed forces in the field of 12 August 1949. Anybody violating the Geneva Convention, no matter which side, will be subject to prosecution in international courts. Please do your best to document any breaches of the Geneva Convention so that we can bring such people to face justice. Thank you, and have a beautiful day. May Artemis watch all over you. Watch all over you? Watch over you all. Yes, that one. Bye-bye.